Good morning, everybody. Let's see if I can get this to work out today now that I'm back on campus. Week 4 is about mental health. Provider mental health is going to be more of the focus, but going to touch on just trauma and PTSD. Now, this was adapted from something that I did basically a decade ago. All right, so just going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, what the body's response is to stress in and of itself. Okay, the perception of a threat is a threat. The types of stress, whether it's normal eustress or some sort of acute stress reaction, or delayed stress complications. I'm going to be talking about different types of trauma, and with this, I'm also going to touch on um, situations that you will encounter, and you'll see how I'll wrap it all together. Okay. And then, last but certainly not least, responder issues to address when it comes to traumatic incidents and provider mental health. Now, hopefully this thing doesn't do anything crazy, but um, basically anytime we are in a stressful situation, our body, whether it's that dreaded conversation, come into my office, or your significant other, we need to talk, all of a sudden we jump into fight or flight. That sympathetic stimulation, that sympathetic cascade happens. So we get increased alertness, but you see sort of, okay? And what I'm referring to there is it's not a higher functioning cognitive sort of alertness. It's more of a perceptible threat and mitigation, escape or evade. Enhances the memory of the animal in you, okay? You go to a lower state of brainwave activity. Um, Rapid heartbeat and breathing, yeah, that's going to happen. Increased pain tolerance, usually. Why? Because if you're trying to escape or evade or trying to fight off a foe, that that neurological stimulus, that ow, that really hurt, that's going to be kind of distracting to your survival mechanism. Increased pupil size, typically that's going to happen. And again, that's for more input from the surroundings. But at the same time, people with this fight or flight sympathetic stimulation typically get tunnel vision. So, it's an interesting disparity. Um, when you have this fight or flight, sometimes people spaz out and have flight of ideas and, basically look like a squirrel on the highway. And then you get to what I refer to as your lizard brain. Okay, you become very instinctual. Okay, everything happens physiologically, and it's all about escape or evade. Now, sometimes, and just like you have sympathetic stimulation, you can have parasympathetic overriding. Okay, and that is, again, totally instinctual. It's an unconscious reflex. Okay, you see in top right hand corner, you see your fainting goat. Okay, they've got just parasympathetic stimulation. It's an excellent representation of what can happen. And if you look at the physiologic factors that go on with somebody who becomes frozen with fear, okay, heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, they tense up or they faint, okay, vasovagal response. Sometimes that detachment, that numbness, that confusion, you've heard um, the saying, the fog of war before. Well, when people are overly stressed, sometimes, depending on how they cope, that numbness and confusion, feeling overwhelmed, not really knowing what to do. And lastly, lose the ability to problem solve and or escape. Okay, that's why, some people are found trapped in things, vehicles that have gone in water, or house fire situations where it would seem to an outside observer that there's a mode to egress from that vehicle, from that setting. So why didn't they just get out? Well, when you're panicking, you can't really troubleshoot. You don't problem solve well. So basically, I equate that to a horror movie victim. You know, no matter what you think is simple or should be simple, finding that simple fix isn't always something they can do. Okay, so now with our stress, I mean, stress is part of life. You have daily stress if you're a parent or if you're not. If you're a dog mom or dad or a mom or dad to children, you know that stress is just life. But where it becomes a problem is when we start thinking of things like acute traumatic stress or cumulative stress. Okay, so I'm sure you're aware of this, but cumulative stress is prolonged stress which builds up after time and can lead to adverse mental and physical consequences. The acute stress reaction, that critical incident stress, which produces considerable psychological distress, normal reactions to abnormal or extraordinary events. Okay, so think about your work day. That's basically it in a nutshell. Okay, now whether you've ever tried to define a trauma or not, trauma it's an injury. Okay, whether it's physically or emotionally inflicted, it is an injury. Okay, it's a pervasive sense of unwell. It's harm that has happened to you either physically or mentally. And with that trauma, the more that we ignore or the more that it is ignored, the more long lasting and the more serious the problems can be if that person doesn't deal with it. So, you know, when we think of a good trauma call, we typically think of blood, guts, and gore, but all calls, well, not all, but most calls traumatize someone, okay? And it to varying degrees, it traumatizes us. So when we think of trauma, again, we think of body injury, wound, shock, that sort of thing. In psychiatry, trauma is different, okay? It's an experience that is emotionally painful, distressful, or shocking, which, if untreated, often results in lasting mental and physical effects, okay? So if you want to climb on the Dr. Phil couch for a minute, we deal with emotionally painful things all the time. We deal with distressed individuals and distressful situations. We see things that would shock and be repulsive or just, you know, be untenable for most people who are not in our profession to deal with. Not all day, every day. We're not in full combat mode, but we do see enough of it. And even some of the quiet calls, okay, where there's no blood, guts, and gore, where you know that this person is probably leaving their house for the last time. That's traumatic, especially when they have a spouse, you know, the little old man, little old lady, and their significant other. We all take a little bit of that with us. So these are some things that this presentation was built on. Okay, these types of traumatic events that EMS providers and first responders in general are going to deal with. Okay, so we're going to see how pervasive the problems are, and let's see if we run into a theme. Okay, so one of the worst things that's ever been my responsibility to deal with is child abuse. Okay, physical abuse or emotional abuse, neglect, all of it is just maltreatment. Okay, either it's an intentional act to physically harm or to sexually exploit a child, or it can be an overt action just to keep that kid on their heels, so to speak. Okay, that's their injury to the psychological capacity or emotional stability of the child. When you think of kids being abused, we always tend to think about physical and sexual abuse. What we don't see and what we don't really take stock of is the emotional abuse that happens, because there's no visible scars. Now, neglect, that's depriving or the deprivation of adequate food, clothing, shelter, your basic needs. Okay. Now take a look at that picture in the lower right. 1 of every 3 girls will be sexually assaulted by the age of 18. 1 out of 7 children are abused. And even though this was clipped from an advertisement not really an advertisement, but a campaign for awareness of child abuse and neglect, those statistics still bear out to this day. It is a far more common problem than we like to admit to ourselves. Okay, so to get you to see some of the stuff that's in this slide, I'm going to have to zoom in and out, so please bear with me. Okay, so child abuse and maltreatment. Studies show 80% of young adults who have been abused as children had at least one psychiatric disorder at the age of 21. 80%. Okay. Depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse, suicide attempts. When your coping mechanisms are essentially cut off at the knees, when they are forming, then you can't develop those coping mechanisms. And if you can't develop those coping mechanisms, you're broken. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. I just mean you're broken as in not living up to what your potential could have been. Okay? The effects of child abuse: impaired brain development, poor physical health, psychological issues, relationship issues, substance abuse, mental or behavioral issues, and that repetitive cycle of abusing others. Okay? Now, again, I apologize for this, but in the lower right hand corner, what happens to the kids? Well, you can see it's actual brain changes. Their emotion regulation center, it's underactivated. Their amygdala, the fear center, that's overactivated. So basically, these big bubbles right here tell you that you've got brain change in a kid. Okay. When you look at this slide, okay, long-term impacts, affects perception of reality in some cases, wires the brain to expect danger, triggers fight or flight or freeze response, that sympathetic or parasympathetic response to danger, to threatening situations, creates relationship problems. Okay. Having mommy or daddy issues. Okay. It's not just that, it is sometimes people gravitate toward what harms them the most because that's the pattern that was ingrained. It takes away the sense of safety, increases stress hormones flowing throughout the body, creates a sense of helplessness, results in serious behavior problems. Kids who have childhood trauma, okay, 2 times more likely to develop depression, 3 times more likely to develop anxiety disorders. And how does that happen? Well, down here, child abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. They are witness to violence being perpetrated in the home. Neglect, not having their needs met. Substance abuse or misuse. Bullying in school. As shameful as it is, we have 10 and 12-year-olds that kill themselves because of bullying. And where did that kid learn to be a bully? Grief, war and terrorism, that is childhood trauma depending on where you are. Medical trauma, potentially. Could be separation from loved ones. There are various factors that cause this trauma. Okay, and with that, they're going to be picking up the pieces or repeating patterns for the rest of their life. Now, the intimate partner violence or domestic partner violence, IPV, if you haven't seen statistics on it, I'm going to show you some that are specific to North Carolina here in just a couple of slides. But IPV in and of itself, it doesn't have to be, the prototypical married or male-female relationship. I'll show you some statistics on that in just a moment. But it's basically anybody in a relationship, okay? And this IPV doesn't have to be kicks and punches. If you look at the right-hand side, tools of domestic abuse, violence, okay, using coercion and threats, using intimidation. But look at the 2 and 3 o'clock position, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using the kids, controlling all decisions, using economic abuse and coercion and threats. With all of this, it's about power and control. And in some cases, the reason that that power and control is being inflicted on that person, it's not that they're weak, it's because that person who is doing this, refer back to that last slide, they witnessed this during their formative years. And patterns repeat unless that person deals with the issues. So, but in all of this thing, in intimate partner violence, okay, domestic violence statistics, 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines daily. 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims. So, as you see, it is a pervasive problem. Okay? Women between the ages of 18 and 24 are the most commonly abused. Just when you think that shouldn't be the case, yeah, it actually is. Okay, 20 is the age. 1/3 of women become victims of dating violence. And there's some shocking statistics on high school age females, okay, that I might have in this presentation here in a little bit. 15 million children are witness to domestic violence each year. Every 9 seconds in the U.S., a woman is assaulted or beaten. These are shocking statistics. The cost of intimate partner violence, $5.8 billion per year. Not only do we count stalkings and rapes, physical assaults, this is just a myriad of crappy behavior. I mean, I don't mean to make light and just call it crappy behavior. It is shocking once you look at all of that. And what do all of these situations, the last slide and this side, have in common? When they call 911, who goes out and deals with them? We do. For this domestic violence, this IPV, National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Okay, here's some CDC data for you. 1 in 4 women will be victims of domestic violence, and 1 in 7 men. 1 in 5 homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. 1 in 12 girls in high school experience both physical dating and sexual dating violence while in high school. 1 in 12. Over 1,300 annual deaths attributed to IPV, and that's causing about 2 million injuries annually. 30% of abused women suffer their first episode while pregnant. Guess who did it? The person that got them pregnant. 85% of victims in IPV cases are women. 80 to 90% of domestic violence victims abuse or neglect their children. Now, when you look at all of the information on this particular slide, yeah, it's shocking, okay? And the intended audience for this first part of the presentation, it was for a law enforcement background. It was basically a presentation to bring mental health awareness to them in dealing with these situations. So it's packed with statistics. But again, the pervasive theme of all of this is who is responding to all these calls. It's not just law enforcement, it's also us. And every call you run and every patient you encounter, you give a little something of yourself and you take a little something with you. Okay, so the non-traditional sort of intimate partner violence situations. Okay, statistics: 1 in 8 lesbian women are sexually assaulted, 2 in 5 gay men are sexually abused, 1 in 2 transgender people are sexually assaulted, 1 in 2 bisexual men experience sexual violence, 1 in 4 bisexual women experience sexual violence. Lesbian and bisexual women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence. So it's not just an old cops episode with somebody in a wife beater and the prototypical redneck beating up on the the mother of their children. It happens to anybody, or it can happen to anybody, no matter who you love. If it's not a healthy relationship, this kind of stuff can take place. And when it happens, they have limited resources, limited options, limited ways to get away from them. But one of the ways that they're going to get away or seek out help is calling 911, and that's where we come in. So again, I built this back in about 2010. Let's see how the statistics bear out. In 2010, 107 North Carolinians lost their lives in domestic violence murders. Okay, of those, 70 were female victims, 37 were male victims, and the murders were committed by 96 male offenders and 11 female offenders. In 2020, okay, jump forward a decade, 134 lost their lives. Okay, 77 were female, 57 were male. Murders were committed by 99 male offenders and 32 female offenders. It's still a violent world, and it's only getting worse. And we get to see it. We get to deal with it. Community and school violence. Okay, predatory violence, robbery, for example, violence that comes from personal conflicts between people who are not family members. So basically, bullying. Okay, to an extent. Okay. With that, this was built for law enforcement, but so it talks about fatal and non-fatal student victimization. That's whether they're taking a kid's lunch money, beating them up, taking their shoes, all of the great behaviors that are demonstrated in society these days. Intimidating a teacher, okay, fighting a teacher, students being threatened or injured with a weapon at school, fights at school, students carrying weapons at school. All of these things represent a show of violence, if not overt violent acts. Now, the latest statistics that I could pull up were 2019, okay, or at least for this, with these school violence facts. And this was a study done, and this was the sample size, 13,000 plus students. Okay, about 1 in 5 high school students reported being bullied on school property in the last year. 8% of high school students had been in a physical fight on school property 1 or more times during that previous year. More than 7% of high school students have been threatened or injured with a weapon, for example, gun, knife, whatever, on school property 1 or more times during the 12 months before that survey. Almost 9% of high school students had not gone to school at least one day during the previous month before the survey because they felt they'd be unsafe at school. And this is what people are dealing with. And again, when something does happen, EMS has to respond. Now, I do talk about school shootings, and I believe in the Second Amendment. I'm not going to try to turn this into a political debate. I have guns. Guns are a good thing. But looking at school violence facts, we just have to look at the numbers. Total of 93 school shootings with casualties at public schools and private elementary and secondary schools during the 2020-21 school year. That's more than any year to date. Okay. Now, with that, we also see a big increase in cyberbullying. We also see a big increase in, just man's inhumanity to man. Now, not to get all touchy-feely and things like that, but this is a uniquely United States issue. Okay, if you look at the statistics and how they bear out, school shootings by country from 2009 to 2018, this is what you get. Mexico had 8, and they were in the second spot. United States had 288. South Africa, India, Nigeria, Pakistan. Places that we in the West, or we in America, like to think that, oh, we are more advanced, more whatever than some of these countries. They are so backwoods, they are so whatever. Really? Is that how it looks out? Is that how it shapes out? Is that what it looks like? Because if you just look at it by the numbers, then it's a uniquely U.S. problem. And again, what happens? Anytime there is something that goes on at a school, EMS is going to be called. Now, natural disasters, look, Wake County showed up in the pictures. That's awesome. But whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, wildfires, big commercial fires, doesn't really matter. I mean, no matter what happens, we show up because we are the helpers, in essence. Okay? And with that, we have to think about all of the other things that aren't just natural, but they're imposed. Terrorism, for instance. Okay? The object of terrorism is to change somebody's mindset, to change the way that they live, to make them cower to whatever your ideology or your agenda is. That's what terrorism is. Okay? And you're basically looking at the 3 biggies of political, religious, or ideological. Okay? So if you think about terroristic acts on U.S. soil, okay, 9/11, okay, certainly we lost over 300 firefighters, we lost a multitude of police officers and first responders in general, EMTs and paramedics. What was that for? If you look at the Boston Marathon bombing, what was that for? If you look at Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City, way back when, what was that for? It was one of those big 3, political, religious, or ideological issues. Somebody has an axe to grind, and they want to take it and make you change the way that you live. So, anyway, and what do we see at all of those scenes? We see EMS dealing with the catastrophic injuries, and then I promise we're getting to what I consider the more important subject matter. Traumatic grief. Okay, if you've never heard of the concept, you know what grief is. Okay. Now, traumatic grief can be characterized as an unexpected, untimely death. Kind of like some of our patients have, and some of the situations that we deal with. Sudden deaths do not allow us to prepare. Okay, so when we're not prepared, then it sometimes takes a much bigger effect on that individual, and that is transferred over to the people that are there to help in those circumstances, us. Such events result in psychological trauma that must be treated before grief issues can be addressed. There are lots of people that cannot grieve effectively because they get stuck in one of those areas of the grieving process. Like this. I'm sure you've seen Kubler-Ross before. Okay, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. DABDA. Okay, they can't believe it. Now they're angry at God because this is happening. That person is going away. They bargain with God. They become depressed, and finally they accept that this is the new reality. Their loved one is gone, and then they're healed, right? No, they can get stuck in any of those stages. Okay, they might not get to the end of the race. They might not get ever to acceptance, and at the same time, while we're helping with patients, we're also kind of doing some of this as well. When you think of those traumatic incidents that were just on the screen with the terrorism, okay, we go through the grieving process as well. We can't save everybody, and that's hard for us to deal with as clinicians. So, some things that I want to bring to your attention, okay? Stress disorders after trauma, okay? When we start thinking about how has this changed me, or how is this changing an individual, we've got to look at some of these things, some of the ways that individual, their personality changes a little bit, okay, or yours may. Okay, it's hard to look in the mirror and see that these things are happening to you, but you as a partner, a friend to somebody that you're working with, it's easier for you to spot that some of these things might be happening to someone that you care about. So, if you've never had the misfortune of having a call that you replayed in your head, good. I hope that you don't. Because when we play the what if game in school, what if this happened, what would I do? And when we're functioning, sometimes we play the what if game. What if I'd only done that? What if I'd done just a little bit more? What if I'd tried this? Could I have made a difference? And sometimes those what ifs lead us to these kind of responses. Now, stress disorder in and of itself, development of fear, helplessness, or horror in response to an event, including actual or perceived threat to self. Now, hold on. An acute stress disorder or accumulative stress disorder, trust me when I tell you that it doesn't just have to happen to that individual. It doesn't just have to happen to you. We deal with proxy a lot. We deal with other people's physical and emotional issues a lot, and that is a little bit transference over to us. Okay, so the witnessing of an event involving a death or a threat or harm to another, learning of the death or threat to a family member or a friend, all of those can lead to PTSD. This is our job description. Dealing with it. Okay. Now, if some of the law enforcement that I was teaching this stuff to, they didn't like PTSD. They were ex-military. They thought it was somebody trying to gold brick or get out on some sort of psych, and they just had a really anti-PTSD stance. Okay. All right. Cool. But PTSD is not something that's new. Okay, if you don't like the name, okay, we'll use one of the old names that used to be used. After the Civil War, it was called Soldier's Heart. In World War I, it was called battle fatigue. In World War II, it was called shell shock. Hey, if you weren't in the military and you never went to war, but you're a female and you were raped, they've got a name for it too, post-rape syndrome. That's from the 40s and 50s. If you were in the touchy-feely 60s and 70s, accident neurosis. And then hey, let's blame it on Vietnam, post-Vietnam syndrome. As long as there's been battle and as long as there's been war and carnage, this kind of thing is going on. People have had these kind of problems. So if PTSD, the concept, the name hangs you up, just pick another name. It's the same thing. So let's look at PTSD for a second. Okay, for you to be diagnosed with PTSD, okay, you will have persistent re-experiencing of the traumatic event. You'll have flashbacks to a certain extent, okay, and these can be brought on by sights, sounds, something sensory, smells even, avoidance of person, places, things, or emotions associated with the event. I've known paramedics that would take a 5-mile detour to go around an intersection where they had a really brutal call. People trapped in the vehicle on fire. Yeah. And they got there before the people were deceased. So they drove the long way around to work because it was just too painful psychologically to go through there, because it brought them back. Physiological response when exposed to stimuli associated with the event. So that fight or flight kicks in, okay? That heartbeat increase, respiration increase, your body, perception of threat is a threat. So psychologically, you're reminded of, and physically you respond in kind. Trouble sleeping, concentrating, and having frequent nightmares. Angry outbursts even. Okay, some of the things that we've been talking about, that I've already seen some of your discussion postings, and I am loving the discussion, by the way. I'm glad that I've chose to put this topic in. What I wanted everybody to think about is burnout doesn't have to be there. Okay, that concept doesn't have to be there. We can help take care of each other. And that's, later on toward the end of this, and it's not too much longer, but later on toward the end of that, there are a lot of resources. If we just know about them and reach out to them, we can, try and take care of each other. Now, if you want to be diagnosed, or if you are diagnosed with PTSD, the DSM criteria, that's a diagnostic manual for psychological assessment, okay, basically. So to have any sort of diagnosis, you have to have a multitude or, a certain number of signs or symptoms of that particular issue for a certain amount of time, and you also have to be in front of a clinician who's willing to, give you that diagnosis. But what it boils down to is, if you've got too many things in these categories, then if you've got them for greater than a month, you have PTSD. Okay. Now, check out the blue box. Direct experience as a witness, learning that it happened to someone, or exposure to adverse details. All of those things represent potentials for the development of PTSD. So whether it happened to you or not, you can develop PTSD from that event. And that's I consider it a no-brainer, but sometimes people, well, you weren't there when it happened. You're right. But I had to deal with the aftermath. I had to think about physically what must have happened. I got to see all the carnage. Yeah, it happened to me too. Now, just my own issue, or not own issue, but my own opinion, okay, not of JCC, but my own opinion is, most of the time I think that EMS practitioners don't have PTSD, they have CPTSD, okay? Yeah, there are multiple types, okay? Now, if you look at post-traumatic stress disorder over here on the left. All right. We know normal stress response. Okay, everybody copes with that. Acute stress disorder, group of symptoms that occur within a month of the traumatic experience, but you can process and get through it. And then uncomplicated PTSD, related to a single major traumatic experience instead of multiple events. And then you look at number 4. Number 4, I think, is in our wheelhouse. Okay. And the reason that I want you to consider that is it is successive trauma. It is multiple traumas. You know, you don't have just one bad call most of the time. You have many difficult calls leading up to the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, sometimes is that a cumulative effect? Yes. Sometimes could it be the outright carnage of that last call that just broke the camel's back? Yeah, it could be that as well. I'm not here to discount anybody's feelings. I'm just saying, with the diagnostic criteria and with, you know, what you can find out about PTSD and its various types, it would seem to me that most EMS practitioners are likely to have 4 and 5. Okay. Now, with that, I'm not saying everybody in EMS is crazy. I'm not saying that everybody in EMS has some sort of mental diagnosis. I'm saying that statistically, it's more likely. You'll see that bear out in a little bit, but statistically, it's more likely that we have depression, that we have other psychological issues that go along with and contribute to PTSD. So that complicated and comorbid PTSD, I think, is where we are, or where a lot of practitioners would be. Okay, and over here, okay, in the top right-hand corner, anxiety. Okay, with that, impulsive, trust issues, depression, hopeless, gaslighting. Now, you might not see it in yourself. Again, you might not see it in yourself, but you may see it in people that you know. You may see it in coworkers. And this, if this is you, this complex PTSD, I think you should get help. If this is somebody you care about, somebody you work with, they need help. Because even though this is horrendous, this last thing over here to the bottom right, suicidal thoughts, you'll see some shocking revelations when it comes to the presence of, or the incidence of, suicide in first responder community. It's a tragedy. Now, if you look at some of the PTSD among first responders, paramedics, 15%. Rescue teams, flight teams, whether it be hospital-based nurses and things like that, or whether it be like USAR sort of response teams, firefighters, police officers. Because we deal with the worst situations, we have an increased incidence of it. Now, have you ever felt like this? Take time, look over there on the left-hand side, feeling distressed, upset, or angry when startled by loud noises, feeling overwhelmed in crowds. I don't like crowds to this day. Feeling if you're permanently damaged or worthless. Permanently damaged? Yeah, I don't know about worthless, but that's, usually somebody else makes that determination. Feeling as if you're hugely different to others. Feeling nobody can understand what happened to you. Avoiding friendship and relationships or finding them very difficult. Basically being awkward in non-EMS related people. If you watch people in EMS or first responder communities, they like to hang out with other people in the first responder community because they get me. Those are my people. That's my tribe. They know me. They know what I've been through. It's a similar bonding experience. Not everybody's going to experience dissociative symptoms, okay? But most are going to have hypervigilance and high anxiety. And, because of the toll, physical toll, who knows if that back pain or that neck pain is that a pulled muscle, or is that your body screaming out, help me? Now, this CPSD, okay, the reason that I put this slide in there is this is how people cope. Okay, these are some of the things that they do to cope if they have CPTSD. Saying that for some reason is always getting me tongue-tied. But normally they're going to pick between two of these. Okay, but if you look at it, you can also see down at the bottom of this behavior some things that they might be misdiagnosed with or mislabeled by friends or clinicians that's going on with them. Okay. Now, again, this CPTSD is from successive trauma. It's from the accumulation, and you have been knee-deep in it for a while. Now, is everybody going to be angry and aggressive? No. But are they going to potentially be obstinate and don't want to hear somebody else's point of view? Yeah. Sense of entitlement? Maybe. Demands perfection from others. And all of our complaining about, not really complaining, but all of our noting that the preceptor-preceptee relationship is completely jacked these days. Do you think this may have something to do with it? Dictatorial tendencies. It's good to have, goals and benchmarks and how you evaluate people, but look at this. Is that possibly why we have issues in that dynamic? Flight, very obsessive or no compulsive behavior. They are OCD about their truck. Feelings of panic or anxiety, maybe. Rushing around, over worrying, workaholic. Can't sit still or relax. They're very particular about the way that they do things. Tries to micromanage situations and other people. That describes a lot of people that I've worked with over the years. That describes me to a certain extent when I was on the truck. I worked 24/48, and when I wasn't working my full-time job, I was working my part-time job and teaching part-time. EMS, and that was all that I did, all that I knew. How about over here? You ever just had I'm not having a good people day, and so you hibernate, isolating yourself from the world? You're just so tired that you turn into a couch potato. You're so overwrought with decisions that you can't make one. You get analysis paralysis. You want to do things, but I don't know if I really want to go after that promotion. Maybe I don't need it. Maybe I don't deserve it. Now, again, when you have this CPTSD, you're going to have one or two dominant stress responses that they typically fall back into as their main mode of reacting to stressful triggers and situations or perceived threats. So when they come into the next stressful situation, they dive into work. They become overly critical of others. They become angry and aggressive. How about the fawn? People pleasing, scared to say what they really think. They get run over. They let people bully them. They let people push them around. They kiss butt. They flatter to avoid conflict. Can't stand up for themselves. Can't say no. What do you think? It's my thought that a lot of burnout in various forms and a lot of compassion fatigue and a lot of the things that we see wrong with that SWOT analysis and the way things are being done is maybe, does it have to do with this a little bit? And we have gone so long and so far without recognizing where we truly are when it comes to provider mental health, that we are just ingrained. Just a thought. So, our PTSD statistics: an estimated 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their lives, and up to 20% of these people go on to develop PTSD. Okay? Now, doesn't mean that they're going to have PTSD for the rest of their lives. It just means for more than a month's time, and they do have the symptom pattern of PTSD. All right? So, 1 of every 13 people in the U.S. develop PTSD in their lifetime. Women are twice as likely to develop PTSD as men. Okay? Now look over here at the blue. Survey discovered 100% of public service responders report exposure to traumatic events, and there's a strong link between high levels of chronic and critical incident stress to PTSD and alcohol. I'm not saying that you're a drinker. I'm not saying that you're a drunk. I'm not saying that having alcoholic beverage is a bad thing. But it's not a coping mechanism. At least it's not an effective one most of the time, not long term. 1 in 5 of EMS workers experience diagnosed PTSD. That's from EMS World. Nearly 1 in 4 police officers think suicide at some point in their life. That's from a CDC report. 27% of firefighters have struggled with substance abuse issues. When you look at the dry numbers, you kind of lose perspective sometimes. But when you bring it into our world, we 100%, everybody, fire, EMS, law enforcement, we all respond to traumatic incidents. And whether it's big trauma or little trauma, we all go there. And 1 in 5 of us experience diagnosable PTSD. Now, you've probably seen statistics when it comes to, military, when it comes to PTSD, right? And, when this was built, 10, 12 years ago, soldiers returning back from the Middle East 17 times more likely to commit suicide than someone of the same age without military deployment history. And that's true. Everybody knows the 22 veterans a day die by suicide. Okay? You can't see it right now, but I wear a 22 a day bracelet on my wrist because, I don't know, I just, if somebody sees me, I have such respect for the military that, they need to acknowledge the fact that some of our best and brightest come back broken, and we're not doing enough to help them. Now, having said that, we're also not helping them before they commit suicide. We're not getting them good mental health care at VA, and it's not a political discussion about Republicans or Democrats or whatever. It's a failure of our society. And sometimes when they come back, one of those PTSD symptoms, let me back up for just a second, upset, angry, when they're startled, okay, that's CPTSD. And sometimes it's going to be risk-taking behaviors, okay? It's not just that. Their bodies become so ingrained in having that increased increased adrenaline all the time, that they become adrenaline junkies just to feel something. And then let's look at this, okay? Antisocial personality disorder. Again, one of the things that CPTSD is actually misdiagnosed, or can be, okay? Pattern of contempt and violation of the rights of others characterized by deceit, manipulation. Okay, gaslighting, that was back in CPTSD. Failure to conform to social norms. Entitlement, that was back in CPTSD. Pattern of law violations, authoritative noncompliance, again, entitlement. Repeated acts of aggression against others, that was back in CPTSD. Difficulty keeping a job. Okay, well, if you're confrontational, it's going to be kind of hard to do that. Financially irresponsible. Yeah, okay. Little to no conscience regarding their violent behavior. They can justify their actions. Entitled. But is it antisocial personality disorder, or is it prolonged exposure to traumas? So, this is, if you've never heard of vicarious trauma, this is what happens to us. Okay, negative changes that happen to humanitarian workers. We fall into that category. It happens to you because you care. You cared enough to do the job, you cared enough to get the education, you cared enough to get put on the uniform and that social contract day after day, shift after shift, taking care of other people. And it is that day after day, shift after shift, ongoing beatdown that gives us the vicarious trauma. And it does change you psychologically and spiritually. It changes your well-being, your sense of self, how you relate to the world, most of the time, to various degrees. Okay? I'm not saying everybody's going to become antisocial and think that, you know, God is a joke, or, you know, whatever. I'm just saying that it changes who you are and how you approach the world and the people within it. 40 to 80% of helping professionals experience high rates of secondary trauma. Now, here's an interesting little quote for you. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. It rubs off. The people that we deal with and the things that we deal with, it rubs off. First responders bear witness to damaging and cruel treatment experienced by others, shattering any assumptions of invulnerability. You know, one of the things about teenagers is they think they're invincible. Is there anybody in EMS that thinks they're invincible anymore? We've seen stupid accidents. We've seen people our age or younger, and by a momentary lapse of reason, be taken out of the realm of the living. We've seen babies. We understand when it's the older generation, when they're about 100 years old. And yeah, we understand that. But, you know, people my age dying, people younger than me dying. It all seems so senseless. Vicarious trauma is just secondhand shock. That's all it is. It's the cumulative impact, again and again, call after call. Even the stories we tell at shift change. I'm not saying hold it all in, don't have a conversation, but even those stories. Now, I went through and found some EMS related art, right? And the reason I did this is because of what? We're here doing our job. And even though this is an illustration, maybe that's a ghost. Maybe this is the spirit of the guy that we couldn't save. Maybe this is, you know, an angel trying to comfort us for trying to do our job. Maybe this is an all too common scene for us. We're working a code at the house and it's unsuccessful. But what else is in this lower pane over here? We've got family. We've got the wife, presumably. We got the kids. we got the tragedy. And yeah, we run that call, but we got the tragedy because they don't have a dad, she doesn't have a husband, and we're there to witness. This one, with this, most everybody I've ever been around in EMS is, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? If I go out and do talks about EMS profession, somebody's going to ask me that. And could I tell them gross stories? Yeah. But I can't describe to them what it's like to hear a wife shriek with god-awful pain and horror when she's just been told by the ER doc that her husband died 2 days before Christmas. I can't tell them about that because that's not gross. That's not what they were expecting. But I also can't forget that sound. I can't forget the things that we've seen, and not all of it is the blood, guts, and gore. Some of it is dealing with the families. Some of it is realizing you tried your best, there was nothing you could do, but it's the after effects. It's the senselessness of it all. Last week, we were talking about precept to precept D and SWOT analysis, and this week we kind of transitioned into burnout a little bit. I've seen that a bit. Burnout, lots of professionals don't like that term. Okay, they do consider it compassion fatigue. Basically, you're jaded. All right. You can think of it as a secondary traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Basically, you've given so much that you don't have it left to give. Okay. But because you don't have it left to give, you don't give as much of yourself to your patients, to your partners, to the profession. And you know, I apologize for singling anybody out, but there was somebody that posted in the discussion board about experiencing burnout and how big of a piece of crap they felt like they were, and they weren't doing their job well, and they didn't feel good about it, and all of those things. And I applaud that person for that introspection. And when they changed location after a bit of time off, when they changed the agency that they worked for to go to a better place, they were in a better place psychologically. A lot of the things that you deal with, yeah, everybody deals with the frequent flyer, and sometimes they can get nerve-wracking. But some of this stuff is just to remind you about, it's not all blood, guts, and gore. We get frustrated with the abuse of the EMS system. We get frustrated sometimes that there's an app for everything, and you're missing some of the most important things, which is to have compassion, which is to have empathy, which is to be a professional. And then we deal with those folks that say, yeah, none of this stuff ever gets to me. That's never true. I've not met a professional that it didn't get to, ever. I've never met a volunteer that it didn't get to. Now, could they exist? Yeah, but I think they'd probably get their own psychological diagnosis. Sociopath, something like that. Just saying. So burnout is basically compassion fatigue. With burnout, a psychological term for the experience of long-term exhaustion and diminished interest to depersonalization or cynicism, usually in a work context. Now, most of the time we see stuff like this and we think it's funny, and we see the truth in it. Okay, year 1 EMT, shoulder pain. Shoulder pain can be a symptom of cardiac, blah, blah, blah. You can read this just as well as I can. So by the time that they've been there for a while, yeah, my shoulder hurts too. Where's the empathy going? Even in year 2, they better be dying. When we can no longer extend ourselves to help, to be a positive influence, that's when burnout or compassion fatigue is set in. We get cynical, we're jaded, and the reason some of this stuff is in here, again, because we develop that gallows sense of humor. Okay. Down here, I don't know if you've ever had the radio call where someone in a supervisory role said something to you and you've had this internal struggle. God knows I have. Ask me something stupid on the radio. Say, should I be my smart ass self, or should I just be professional? Or can I just mess with them just for the sake of messing with them? Now, in addition to all of the other things that we've had to contend with, this one right here is the new wrinkle that's come in the last couple of years, COVID. Not only have we had to deal with work stress, but home stress. Am I getting sick? Am I taking anything home to the kids? And, everything. Plus, the kids are at home. They're not going to school. Holy crap. There's no time off. There's no day off. I've got to people all the time. Does that sound familiar? I love my kids dearly. Would do anything in the world for them. But oh my God, they can push my buttons just about as fast as anything in the world, if not faster. So, burnout and PTSD, is there an overlap? Yeah, there is. If you look at burnout and PTSD, where the overlap takes place, you got numbing, lack of empathy. And that, we think of burnout. Negativism or cynicism, we think of that as burnout. But it goes back here. And when you look deep enough into this topic, it also goes with the body stresses, the physiologic stresses of first responders, working shift work, not getting good sleep. I mean, we're, pardon the expression, but we're screwed. Not eating right, not exercising right, not resting well, and then dealing with all the trauma that we have to see. We are set up for this to run rampant, and it has, but it doesn't have to. That's where we're going with this in a couple of minutes. So, difficulty relaxing, always waiting for it to happen, waiting for the crap to hit the fan, okay? Never at ease, low self-esteem, worthlessness. People, you know what, I should have done something else. I hate EMS. I should have gone to this or that. When you have burnout and compassion fatigue, that's the minimization of your skill set, the minimization of your training and your profession that you'll hear people say. Withdrawal pulls away from pleasurable activities and people, and that can be anything from conversation to outright activities, going out doing things that they used to find pleasurable. Isn't that also avoidance and PTSD? Inability to face the day, hopelessness and poor attitude. God, I hate going to work. Tones go off. They better be dying. Excessive use of alcohol. Now, to make light of the situation, I said define excessive. Trying to use alcohol as an escape, a numbing agent. Novocaine for the soul, or Novocaine for the psyche. That's what excessive would be. trying to cure oneself, treat oneself with mind-altering substances is not a coping mechanism. It's escapism. And if you've ever worked with somebody who has burnout, this one right here, feeling overworked or underworked, perceived victimization, you know, they pick on me. They do this, they do that. A lot of burnout or a lot of compassion fatigue, a lot of those people typically think that when somebody says something to them about it, it's no longer a friend or coworker or supervisor trying to help them. You're just picking on them. Now, if you've ever been through CISM or CMS or CISD, critical incident stress management or critical incident stress debriefing, you know, it hasn't always been around. Okay, so it was basically theorized back in the 70s and 80s, trying to mitigate traumatic stress, and you know, we adopted it into first responders, fire and law enforcement first. EMS kind of tried to deal with it. Okay. Now, if you've ever been through a debriefing, some people find it helpful, some people find it not so much. Okay, and I think they're both right. I think it boils down to how are your coping mechanisms. Okay, how are you able to process what you've been through? Okay, but its intention is to mitigate the impact of that critical incident. Okay, it's not the hot wash or the psych first aid that typically occurs on shift during that time frame. Okay, it's not the, all right, I'm taking the truck out of service, let me talk to my people, make sure that they're good. By the way, if you don't have that policy in your agency, you should. Okay, I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but you should. And if it's not there, you should push for it. So anyway, but CISD, you're basically looking at time to process, internalize a little bit, and then to come together, all the people that are shareholders or stakeholders in that incident so that they can discuss the incident. Now, it's not the blame game. It's to talk about feelings. It's not to assign blame. Now, in all of this, we talked about a lot of different psychological issues and psychological problems and all of that stuff. So how do we deal with it? Well, again, that's going to be up to the individual. Let's start off with the simple things, okay? Have a support system, family, friends, co-workers. Keep yourself present with all of those, okay? If you're religious, if you go to counseling, have that person, have that safety net that you can talk to. The basics physiologically, eat good food, not a bunch of food. Sleep as good as you can when you're not on shift. Exercise, it is important, okay? So I apologize for some of the things that you hear. It's just my email racking up. Taking care of yourself physically helps you take care of yourself psychologically. Don't make it worse, okay? CNS depressants, okay, drugs, alcohol, things to numb the pain. Okay, they're numbing the pain, they're not alleviating the pain, and they're lowering the threshold for what? They're lowering the threshold for you to do something that you wouldn't ordinarily do in a time of crisis. Just because you put on a uniform doesn't mean you're not susceptible to the same sort of poor impulse control that somebody under the influence of drugs and alcohol experiences. Have something other than EMS to do. Have something other than fire and EMS to do. Hobbies, entertainment, recreation, going places seeing beautiful things and getting away from it all. Sometimes that's easier said than done, okay? But it is important that we laugh, okay? You know, humor heals the soul sometimes, okay? But it's also a coping mechanism. We make some really ghoulish jokes, and there's a reason that it's called gallows humor. Avoid negative thinking if at all possible. The guilt because you couldn't save everybody, the guilt that you feel because, you know, in my case, I feel guilty that one of my former students committed suicide because after he left my program and was out doing very well in his career, we were busy and I didn't talk to him as much. And yeah, on calls, we do the best that we can. And the worst thing that we can do is waiting for the outcome to determine how well we did. So asking why, second guessing yourself. There's a difference between looking at it from a clinical approach and seeing how can I get better with my craft versus I should have done that. Why was I not able to save that person? And lastly, whether you see it in this or in other presentations about mental health, reach out, talk. Make sure that you have and utilize that support network. Now, as I told you before, this is a CIT course that I taught in 2012, and I updated the information, and it's been 10 years for us since I built this, approximately, to deal with mental health for the first responder community. So let's see how we've done in the last 10 years. 30% of first responders develop behavioral health condition, including but not limited to depression and PTSD, as compared to 20% of the general population. First responders, policemen, and firefighters are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. A survey of more than 4,000 first responders found that 6.6% had attempted suicide, which is more than 10 times the rate in the general population. Roughly 1 in 3 first responders develops PTSD. That's opposed to 1 in 5 in the general population. First responders believe mental health is as important as physical health, but feel that there are repercussions for seeking help. It's also estimated that 40% of cases of provider PTSD and mental health issues are being reported. So we're only reporting 40% of the time. Now why? Because of this. There might be repercussions. I don't want to, I don't know what else I'd do. I can't be taken out of EMS. I'd rather suffer silently. Now, I'm going to send you all of these resources in an email. Okay. I would load it up, and I'm not sure what will happen if I start clicking on these links, okay? But trust me, there are some really interesting resources here, okay? Some of them are just articles, okay? Some of them are referencing research projects, and some of them are resources that you can use, okay? And it's the resources part. I think that if we're informed, we can make a change, okay? In 2020 and beyond, first responders, mental health, police officers are 2.5 times more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. Police officers witness 108 trauma-involved critical incidents over their careers on average. They have 54% greater risk of dying by suicide compared to American workers in general. That's bad for police officers. Now look at the rest. Here's the thing for you to think of. Fire and EMS personnel contemplate suicide rates 10 times higher than adults. And when we attempt, we're usually successful. Why? Because we know what works. Depression and PTSD are 5 times more common in first responders. 37% of fire and EMS professionals have contemplated suicide at least once. 70% of first responders say that mental health services are seldom or never used, and 85% of first responders surveyed reported mental health symptoms. 85% have the symptoms they recognize, but 70% say that mental health services are seldom or are never used. And back to a previous slide. Why? Because they believe mental health, even though it's important, they feel that there's going to be repercussions at work. Partners aren't going to trust them. They're not going to get passed up for promotion. People are going to see them as damaged goods. That's shameful. So, as you look at this, I haven't snatched these. These statistics are basically from about the 2018, 2019 time frame up to now. Okay, we're still dealing with it. We've been talking about first responder mental health for years. We have been talking about PTSD in first responders for years. We've been talking about PTSD in military for years. But what have we done? We've got a lot of statistics. We've got a lot of percentages. We've got a lot of, hey, I know that 35% of police officers suffer from PTSD. All right, that's an interesting little nugget of information. What are you doing about it? 30% of paramedics, first responders, develop behavioral health conditions, including but not limited to depression and PTSD. Almost a third of the workforce. One of the favorite things that I've seen in the research trying to update these materials is the fact that some places, some locations, some states, some nations are taking it very seriously. Okay. Here's that 70%, 7 in 10 mental health services seldom never used. 85% experience some sort of symptom pattern that they recognize themselves as mental health. The fact that we have agencies, we have outreach, we have people trying to bring this into the forefront is encouraging that something will be done. But until we get over, where we're not seeking help, it's going to be a problem. PTSD is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of absolute strength, because PTSD is earned by doing what others fear. Okay, now that may be a little bit of too much rah-rah depending on how cynical you are, but it's absolutely the truth. When you think about what you do for a profession, not everybody can do it, not everybody would do it, but when they're having their worst day, they expect us to be at our best. That's the expectation, even though they themselves can't do it. So they're afraid of blood, guts, and gore. We're not. It takes somebody special to be an EMS, but having just said that, we don't want to be this ticking time bomb. We don't want to draw our own careers to a conclusion because we're so beat down by it all and too proud or too immovable to seek out help. We earned the help. Now, and again, I'll try and send you out this information as well. Some of it you can access and some of it you can't. Okay. Now, the Canadian Broadcast Company, okay, they have done a documentary about what happens to first responders, and it's on primetime TV. It's hard to get access to it in the States, but you know, if you're smarter than I am, you can stream that and see if they know of which they speak. They're opening facilities for first responders with traumatic stress injuries. They're doing web-based therapy. They're doing a lot of different things. Prevention programs. Their version of OSHA. They're doing psychological screenings before you even get into the field. They're trying to take a proactive rather than reactive look at this ignored cry for help. Australia, same thing. Okay, they've got, you know, Australia, the Outback, you know, they've got telehealth counseling services that you can access on shift. Okay, they have PTSD Awareness Day. They've got charities to donate to. They're taking it seriously. There's a lot of research, and research is great, but there's starting to be a lot more resources. So in 2020 at home, this is a partial list, not a complete list, of some things that you can reach out to. Okay. Now that the recognition is there about how prevalent and pervasive it is, you're finding more and more resources. You can access more and more resources. Okay, so again, I'm going to email all of these resources, all of the ones that I've listed in here, so that you can look them up on your own. I realize this isn't exactly the greatest way, but it's what I can do. Thank you, Blackboard. Anyway, so what can we do? How can we help each other? Okay, 10 things. And I'll just talk while you read through them. Okay, know what chronic stress and traumatic stress are and why they can be harmful. Okay, psychological triggers. Okay, understand that PTSD and the accumulation of trauma is a real thing, and no matter whether you think you're Teflon, it does stick to you. Understand that rates of PTSD and suicide, stresses, PTSD in first responders is 15 to 25%, possibly another 15 to 25% meeting the criteria for partial post-traumatic stress disorder. It's pervasive. Watch each other's backs. Know the signs and symptoms. Okay. We're good at assessment, at least we're supposed to be. So don't turn that off when you're in the bay. Don't turn that off when you're at the building with your partner. Resiliency. Most people don't talk about resiliency. How do you get back to being yourself? Well, it all depends. But if you look at the Road to Resiliency guide, okay, they give you some things that you can attempt, you know, some strategies for yourself, and you can pass on to others. Looking for people in crisis and trying to intervene. Okay, again, some of the highlighted green stuff, obviously those are hyperlinks, and that's going to be in the list of resources. But being attentive, knowing what's going on with the people that you work with, knowing what's going on within yourself. Now, number 6, sometimes we screw this up. Okay, number 6, know how to talk to somebody you're worried about. Okay, have a plan, encourage them to get help and get safe, and help provide them with information where to get help. Okay, and if you read the bottom of this, okay, don't be afraid to ask, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Okay, you didn't plant that idea in their head. It wasn't, hey, have you thought about suicide? No. Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Do you have a plan? We would ask that of a patient. Why can't we ask that of a friend? Why can't we ask that of a coworker? Now, number 7, some people annoy me in life, and rather than climb on that soapbox, I'll just say this. Know what to say and what not to say or do when you're talking with somebody who's going through a mental health crisis. If somebody opens up to you, do not give them the trite responses. It's always darkest before the dawn. Trust God. He's going to sort it out. Suck it up. Man up. You know what? If you're in EMS, you're going to see some awful things. You just got to get thicker skin. You know what? If you can't take that, then I've seen worse than that. Really, awesome. That is a way to drive your friends and coworkers towards suicide or towards a new job. The things that you have mentioned in the discussion board about, people have told you they've seen worse. That's what it is. When somebody opens up that they're having problems and people crap all over their problems because they've encountered worse in their opinion, yeah. Know how to access mental health resources quickly. Okay. Again, more websites and resources. EAP is great. Employee assistance programs, they're great, but unless it's done right, those counselors, they may not have a background that is great and suited for EMS first responder lifestyles. They may not have the experience in dealing with that. If you seek counseling, I encourage you to have this mindset. Find a counselor that has dealt with the military, because the trauma is the same. The deployment's just different. They're gone for months and years at a time. We're typically gone for hours to days. Okay? Same kind of stuff. Know how to improve the culture and reduce the stigma around mental health. That's why there hasn't been enough done in the past 10 years. It's a cultural shift that needs to happen. And it hasn't happened yet. And as many people as are passionate about provider wellness, it's about time for that to happen. As people my age and older are getting out of EMS, retiring, going to the happy ambulance grounds in the sky and that sort of thing, it's going to be left up to you guys to take care of each other. So do better than we've done. Know how to help raise awareness and educate others. Okay, there are resources out there. And again, I'm going to give you all of these hyperlinks, all of these resources for you to look at. Lastly, some more resources and the takeaway message. Okay, My takeaway message is simple for you to think about. Most of your calls are relatively benign. Often enough, we're required to engage in situations that would shock and terrify most people. We deal with the highest level of professionalism while keeping our emotions in check. It's not a requirement to be unfeeling, stow away pain, hurt, doubts, confusion, and anger. It's our responsibility to watch over one another and be there for one another through the grief and healing. We may be seen as heroes in a moment, but in between those moments, we're merely human. You are not alone, no matter what you're going through. There are people out there that want to help, and you should reach out. Okay? So that is the end of that lecture, and I will get those resources emailed out to you. Have a great day.